The Astronauts continued by Stanislaw, translated from the German by the Spirit of Hegel. The Black River. My fears were unfortunately all too well founded. As we stood atop the ridge, we saw a second valley basin ahead of us, a surging sea of fog amidst black jagged rocks. The rocky base lay higher than the valley floor of the white sphere. After a brief discussion, we decided to bypass it to the south, following a gradually sloping ridge that to the northeast became an extension of the actual summit. Loose veils of fog gathered into clouds, flowed out flatly, but slowly and steadily became thicker, rising higher and flooding the slopes. Roped up with the milky precipice on either side, we walked along the ridge. Here and there a light cloud, caught by the wind, pushed up, bumped against the rock, and swam between us. Then I saw only the dark, magnified shadow of Arseniev in front of me. The exertion of the march drove the blood to our faces. Blurry spots of light danced on the screen. Star-shaped phantoms. But one only had to snooze a few times and everything disappeared again. The fog remained, however. I looked at the clock. We had already been walking for 9 hours. The lack of training was making itself felt. Sweat was pouring from every pore, running down the neck, down the throat, and from the forehead onto the face. Amidst intersecting bands of haze, the summit loomed motionless. Its huge, wrinkled, gully-cut slopes were still equidistant. Now the black crest of the ridge dropped steeply and finally disappeared into the flood of clouds. At this point it resembled a now elongated peninsula, surrounded by a white ocean. I suggested a rest. The endangered were very exhausted. Rainer was even limping a little. We camped under a protrusion of the ridge. Fortunately, we didn't have to contend with the main enemy of mountaineers on Earth, frost. The rock was warm as if illuminated by the sun. I heard the chemist say I wanted to take a bar of chocolate with me, but then I forgot it, and we could really use it now. Don't grumble, Doctor, Arseniev grumbled. How long are we going to stay here? He turned to me. We should try to sleep, I replied. That's the best we can do right now. 4 hours are enough, and then I'll wake you up. I'll wake you up whenever I want. A precious gift, someone else said, but I already heard the words as if from a great distance. A multitude of silver ants are running after me. I'm not afraid of them. On the contrary, we get along quite well. Suddenly, I noticed one sitting on my hand. I scream. She demands that I take to the air immediately and fly to the rocket, as my companions are worried about our absence. The others repeated in unison. All my explanation that I can't fly are in vain. Finally, I get angry, wave my hand dismissively, and take to the air. I'm already fluttering clumsily like a chicken above the ground when something suddenly pulls me down again. Very forcefully, a conical metal dome with a huge glass eye approaches me. At first I think it's a nightmare. It took a while before I recognized Arsenius's helmet. He was trying to wake us up. Blinking, I looked at my watch. I had slept for almost 5 hours. Confused, I jumped up. That's probably because we're on an alien planet, I stammered. Meanwhile, Arseniev also woke Rainer and Soltik. We fortified ourselves with the last of the vitamin concentrate, which, like the other food, we could consume thanks to a special device without having to take off our helmets. Then we marched on. The weather was calm. The fog lay motionless beneath us. Where the ridge sloped downwards, we waded up to our knees through the milky mist, at times disappearing completely into it. Every step was dangerous. We pushed ourselves forward for a long time. Hours passed before the gravel of a rock pile crunched beneath our shoes. We now reached the mouth of a wide gully that had cut deep into the mountainside. The approach wasn't difficult, but extremely tiring. The pressure on the scuba diver was getting stronger and stronger. I would have liked to rip my helmet off my head just to breathe freely. I involuntarily looked around. My companions, who were less experienced in mountaineering, had it much harder than I did. Bent over, they trudged through the fog that crept up the slope in small clouds. The summit had long since disappeared from view. As if the blade of a giant plough had passed over this slope, shattered stone slabs lay on both sides of the gully. The floor of the gully was covered with whitish, brittle gravel. High above the edges of the cave-ins stretched yellow, grey, and brown rock towers. Beneath their menacingly overhanging ribs, conical mounds of scree spread out. At 8 in the morning, 17 hours after the helicopter explosion, we climbed the summit. The mountain range flattened to the east into dead, rigid waves. Below us, an endless sea of fog streaked with thin lines of shadow that shimmered dark grey and purple in the distance. Nothing but wisps of fog stretched to the very edge of the horizon. The slope of our summit sank into it, forming a mighty, arched, widely branching mountain embankment. Arsenyev spread the map out on a flat stone and determined, as accurately as possible under the circumstances, the direction in which the cosmic crater was located. Then we positioned ourselves a few dozen meters apart on the highest point of the summit and tried to reach our companions using our radios. The same signals kept coming from space. It was the rocket's automatic transmitter, transmitting 2 tones every 15 seconds, separated by a short pause. We heard the rocket, but it didn't respond to our calls. Perhaps the distance was too great, or our weak waves were being filtered out by radioactive clouds from the dead forest. In either case, after an hour, we gathered around Arsenyev in gloomy silence. The astronomer leaned over the map. "So we'll be spending the night outdoors after all," he said. "Dusk begins today in about 8 to 9 hours. By then we must have found suitable shelter. Severe thunderstorms are expected." He looked over the fog floating hundreds of meters below us. "We can't choose the path. It continues like this." He marked a perfectly straight line on the map in the direction of the rocket. "We still have to wait another half hour," I pointed out. "The descent is, as is well known." "The descent will be easier than the climb," Arsenyev interrupted. When I looked at him in surprise, he placed his hand on my shoulder with a meaningful gesture. Soon after Rayner left, the professor held his helmet against mine so that his voice could be heard even without the radio. He turned off the radio and said, "It's not necessary to tell everything." "Because of Rayner?" He nodded. Since the chemist returned, we didn't speak any further. We leaned our backs against the rock wall, and our eyes only half open from tiredness, stared into the misty abyss. Something strange had been happening up above for a while. The clouds grew thick like isinglass poured into boiling water, flowing apart in rings, twisting and turning, becoming ever lighter, more delicate, more transparent, until suddenly a window appeared in them. It quickly disappeared, but another appeared next to it. The sky shimmered through. The wind drove the puffy clouds further and further apart. "Damn it! Why are you cursing?" asked the astronomer. "The sky, Professor. Just look at the sky." The sky was green, transparent like an emerald, as if the color of the first young sunlit greens had melted into it. High above, feathery golden clouds floated. "Surely carbon monoxide," said Rayner. I'm glad he made that remark, so he wasn't completely apathetic after all. Meanwhile, touched by the rays of light, the fog shone here and there, and the edge of a large cloud seemed to be catching fire. But behind it, far in the west, a huge disk of fire peeped out. A few moments later, it became unbearably hot. The fog was suddenly flooded with molten metal. Just beyond the last shadows, which sped away with unimaginable speed into the farthest reaches, two orgies of light flared up. From the depths, mountains of glowing copper rose. Blood-red abysses, grottos and caves with melting walls opened up. The sun irradiated them with its radiance and carved golden galleries from the restless magma. The entire ocean of still, silent fire breathed. Violet, blue, and rose-red vapors in which manifold rainbows shimmered rose from it. All this lasted until a thick cloud moved in front of the sun. The luminous fog eagles faded and filled with an indefinable grey. "We must pay dearly for this spectacle," Rayner said sullenly. He attached the carabiner to the ring of his belt and strode towards the slope. Arsenyev went first. I followed him, then Soltic, and last Rayner, who could barely lift his feet. Thus began the descent, the next stage on the path to the rocket. The fog was sometimes so thick that even the silhouette of the astronomer walking in front of me disappeared into it. My gaze found no stability, sinking into the endless grey. The outlines of the path, the nearest rocks, even that of my outstretched hand blurred. I felt as if I myself would dissolve into this fog. My state resembled a ghostly dream in which one suddenly no longer senses the reality of one's own existence. Every now and then I called out to my companions. and their voices temporarily banished the feeling of loneliness. For a while the rock sounded bright beneath our feet. Then the stone of a scree slope crunched. After 3 hours of arduous marching, our footsteps became quieter, and our shoes sank into looser ground. We couldn't tell whether we were already on the plain or whether it was just a moderately curved hump, because the readings from the asteroids were no longer reliable. They had been behaving abnormally for some time. The air pressure was falling more rapidly than one might have expected given the marching pace. It seemed that the low pressure that must have been associated with the approaching night was approaching. Soon the level terrain sloped down again. We descended ever deeper. As far as one could see in the thick fog, we now walked through the shallow ravine, a kind of dried-up riverbed, and followed all its windings as we descended. Suddenly we had solid ground beneath our feet again. It was smooth and even, like a city sidewalk. Amazed, I looked around, but there was nothing to be seen. Saltic, who had now taken over the lead of compass, said, "Stopped. There's something there." He pointed to a large patch that stood out darkly against the grey wall of fog. I looked down and stroked the rock. "Listen," I said. "I may be mistaken, but those are square slabs. I feel its softness beneath my fingers. This is the most real sidewalk you can imagine." "A sidewalk? Then maybe there's a restaurant nearby," Raina inquired. Throughout the whole walk we had been treated to samples of his gallows humour. Arsenyev aimed the induction device at the blurry oval spot that had appeared not too far ahead of us. "We're short on time," said the astronomer. "But which of you will come with me?" Saltic and I volunteered, and after a moment's hesitation the chemist joined us. The smooth surface I had called the sidewalk curved and then rose, not very steeply. A few dozen steps brought us to a black opening. The fog was thicker here. The beams of our reflector intersected like bright columns and showed us a spacious cavern. Deep in the space stood a cylindrical structure. I ran toward it over the loose fine gravel that covered the floor. It turned out to be a metal cylinder partially embedded in the ground and closed with a curved plate. I pushed against it with my shoulder. A narrow dark gap opened between the plate and the cylinder, which quickly widened. The lid flew up with a clatter. The interior was empty. "A container," I shouted. My companions now also came down. I stepped aside a little. The grotto was peculiarly irregular and had an elongated shape with slightly sloping walls. The ceiling was curved downward, as if it had sunk into the background. Black shreds of a gigantic cobweb hung down. As I approached and reached for it, I saw that it was crumpled metal. It crumpled like tinder between my fingers and sprinkled me with large black flakes. The beams of my spotlight described a wide circle over the tangles of metal, casting shadows that darted back and forth. Suddenly, they encountered something reddish. I directed the light directly onto it and recognized a drawing on the wall depicting concentric circles. It must have been very old, because the red paint had cracked and peeled off in many places. I turned around and wanted to call my companions. Then I noticed what I was standing on wasn't gravel at all. This vibrating mass, shining in the air, was a layer of those silver creatures, but they were no longer silver, but dull like oxidized pieces of tin. And only their shape reminded me of my little prisoner from the dead forest. Involuntarily I jumped back, but they covered the floor of the entire grotto. With every movement there was rustling sound beneath me. The shrunken scraps of metal hanging from the ceiling swayed gently in the breeze. Only now did I notice that behind them lay something like a large honeycomb. It was the regularly spaced openings that gave the wall this appearance. They formed a polygonal mosaic in which a number of those grey, once silver little creatures were still stuck. A whole pile of them lay at the bottom of the wall. "Look at this," I said in a subdued voice. My companions surrounded me. They pushed aside the remains of the crumbling metal net and examined the light, almost weightless little structures. When they were shuffled from one hand to the other, they rustled and clinked softly like metal scales. With every step, hundreds of tiny pieces of stone splashed in all directions. None of us spoke a word. Suddenly I remembered the drawing and raised the reflector. The lines emerged from the darkness. "That looks like a heliocentric system," Raina murmured. "In the center the sun, Mercury, then the orbit of Venus. That of Earth, of course, that's our solar system. But there's something else there. From Venus, a line dotted with small holes led straight to Earth, connecting the two planets, I was seized by a fear I had never known before. I instinctively looked round, but apart from my companions, there was no one in the cave. The metal scraps moved quietly. Feather-light ruffles dusted down. People were here, I whispered. I didn't dare speak aloud. No, this wasn't made by human hands, Arseniy replied. The wall had a very strange shine, I said after a while. The surface of the wall was covered with a network of fine bluish veins. What could this be, Dr. Rayner? I don't know. I've never seen anything like it. It could almost be aventurite. Aventurite exposed to unusually high temperature. Well, I really don't know, he repeated. Arsenyev stuffed a handful of metal kernels into his snorkel's pocket. Friends, we cannot judge the significance of our discovery at this moment. We must move on, and quickly. In 4 hours it will be night. We left the grotto in silence. The fog had become somewhat darker and taken on a bluish hue, but it was clearing, and we descended the gently sloping path again. I could easily make out the last of us. The terrain now became relatively level, so we could cover the next 10 kilometers fairly quickly. Then the ground seemed to rise again. But it could also be an illusion. Suddenly, a muffled shout sounded from the fog in front of me, followed by a dull echo. I leaped forward. Arsenyev lay on the ground, leaning on his hands. Stop, stop, he shouted, raising his ice axe warningly. A dark chasm opened before him, the bottom of which disappeared into the fog. The opposite edge was invisible even with the help of the radar. Radar suggested that there might not be any at all, and that we were standing on the edge of a steep slope, separating the plateau from the plain. It is less than 30 kilometers to the rocket, said Arsenyev, trying to orient himself on the map. Unfortunately, it was very sketchy and had already led us astray several times during the march. We have to go down. The lower we are, the better. Perhaps we'll find shelter there. Just a few hundred steps further, the wall no longer dropped vertically. In the radar screens, a grain image of sloping surfaces glowed, encouraging us to descend. I took the lead again. Dense supple balls of mist wound around me. It grew darker and darker, the fog turning deep blue, then blackish grey, and finally violet. In some places we had to use our hands, as our iron-shod toes couldn't find any grip on the smooth slabs. It wasn't without a few falls. Further down, the wall was less steep, but it was intersected by deep intersecting gullies. We had to be very careful. One misstep could result in a broken foot. Someone overtook me. I think it was Arsenyev. I looked in the white light of his reflector, surrounded by multiple rainbows. The beam of rays swayed for a while in time with the footsteps, sunk to the ground, and stopped. I was blinded and fell up to my knees into a deep crevice. The strained tendon ached. I sat down to examine the foot. The rope rubbed briefly against the stones, then taut. Hello, Professor. Stay put for a while, I called down. No one answered. I stood up and, slightly limping, walked down towards the light in which the blurry figures moved. Suddenly the reflector's light went out. There's nothing we can do. We have to crawl there, I heard Rayner say. Wait. That was Arsenyev's voice. The reflector flared up again, and its light became a trembling, colourful halo in the haze. I now noticed that both of them were leaning forward. The solid ground dropped sharply at their feet. Only dark streaks of fog floated there. At that moment, Saltik's helmet emerged from the depths. Rayner helped his companion swing himself onto the edge of the rock. You can climb behind it, said the engineer. The gradient decreases, but it gets hotter the deeper you go. It gets hotter. We're probably well on our way to the interior of the planet, said Rayner. Involuntarily, we looked closer. The reflector illuminated 4 black giants in wrinkled robes. Sparks glittered in the lenses of the helmets. We'll sacrifice the magnesium cartridge, Arseniy said, pulling a flat magazine out of his pocket. They were the cartridges from the flare gun that had been left behind in the helicopter. Do any of you happen to have a handkerchief in your outside pocket? Rayner had one. The astronomer attached the corners of the handkerchief to the cartridge with a few threads. It dawned on me the professor knew how to help himself without a flare gun. Once or twice he hit the cartridge primer cap with the handle of his knife. When it hissed, he threw the pack over the edge of the cliff. We watched it with rapt attention. The blinding magnesium light pierced the fog. The slope on which we stood emerged from the darkness, and the opposite wall also became visible. It was perhaps 60 meters away. Immediately afterwards, a brightly lit cloud of steam enveloped the cartridge, but not for long. Before the vapor balls dissipated, with renewed yet rapidly diminishing intensity, the rays burst forth from beneath the impoverished power suit. Trembling, the light merged with the veil of vapor. Down below, a blackish, elongated mass appeared, shining like solidified waves of lava. As the glare faded, it seemed to me as if this mass expanded and then contracted again, like the body of a snake devouring its burrow. And everything disappeared into darkness. As we stepped back from the edge of the ravine, Arseniev stopped and tucked his hands behind the snorkeling suit's belt. It's always like this here. Just when you think the last doubts have been dispelled, 100 new ones appear. What do you think of that one over there? He pointed downwards. I noticed a movement, Rainer began hesitantly. I don't know if I'm mistaken, but... No, you're not mistaken, the astronomer interrupted. One could sacrifice another cartridge, but it's not worth it. He leaned over the edge of the rock again. A beam of light shone out of his reflector into the depths and was swallowed by the fog. What the hell could that be? Perhaps a lava flow, Rainer asked cautiously. I had the impression the mass was flowing. The temperature was too low. Perhaps some kind of channel. Channels on Venus? It's no more than 30 meters down there, I interjected. Light like that makes estimation incredibly difficult. Well, it's no use, we'll have to go down. Please follow me. Arseniev slid down first, with his face turned to the wall. We followed him. Since the gradient was easing, we could turn around and walk a little faster. Grooves with sharp edges ran across the rock, which looked like basalt. Suddenly, Salter shouted, Look out, there it is. The reflector stopped moving. In its beam of rays, a curved bulge appeared, shining greasily, back like the rump of a whale. It filled the flat bed of rock, rising even above the stones of the shore, which were a few dozen meters apart, and disappeared from the range of light on both sides. The surface of this mass was in a constant slow up and down oscillation. It was a rhythmic contraction, the waves of which appeared on the right side and subsided on the left. Peristalsis, someone whispered. Arseniev walked toward the black mass across a rock that jutted out into the bed like a walkway. He stopped at the farthest end so that he could feel it with his foot. A sticky splash stuck on his shoe. The area around the touch spot swelled, a regular rhythm in which the mass had been moving until now disappeared. The air trembled slightly. A gust of wind swept along the walls. The shiny mush began to slowly rise and bulge. At times the mass solidified, semi-liquid as it was, until finally it extended a broad flowing spout like a feeler toward the edge of the rock on which Arseniev stood. Careful, Professor, I shouted. He waited motionless for the hepatic something. The black mush touched his shoes, then it retreated, only to suddenly plunge forward again and engulf them. Out of the fog a hump emerged and rolled towards Arseniev like a wave in the surf. One of us, I think it was Rainer, switched on his reflector. The professor screamed and tried to back away. It flooded round him up to his knees. Again a convulsive tremor shot through the black mass. Back, Professor, back, I shouted. I couldn't understand why he stopped, as if he were glued to the rock. He curled up, his shoulders shaking, as if he were trying to lift a heavy load. Saltik, who was closest to him, jumped from the side and tried to grab him back, but he slipped and fell up to his hips in the black mush. He let out a suppressed scream. I held the rope with both hands and pulled with all my strength. Raynor reached further down. It flew in wide loops, splashing onto the rock. In the light of the reflector, I saw Saltik's face, convulsively contorted. The black current now pushed forward in a broad front against the shore, but we were faster. I caught Saltik by the shoulder and managed to grab Arseniev with my other hand. Raynor helped me climb up the slope. The two rescued men leaned on me with their full weight. One of them was breathing heavily and groaning. Are you wounded? I asked, alarmed. Neither of them could utter a word. Further up, Raynor shouted. Dragging both companions with me, I continued climbing. They could barely take a step. It was as if their legs had turned into stilts. An electric shock, Arseniev finally stammered, struggling to regain control of his constricted throat. We climbed a few more meters higher. Arsenyev had lost his reflector. I pulled out mine and pointed the lens downward. Then I pressed the button. What was happening down there was like a mud eruption. But the movement in this black mass was not passive, obeying gravity. It swelled into nauseating bubbles, swelled, and from its depths new and new waves surged up and flooded the shore. Everyone back. A powerful voice suddenly shouted. I can still see that scene, as if it were today. Arsenyev had torn himself away from my arm. He reached into the pocket hanging from Soltik's shoulder, grabbed the ray gun, and aimed. A white flash hissed into the depths. A terrible glow grazed my chest. Arsenyev fired again. A second flash of lightning struck like a fragment of the sun, right into the center of the swollen black mass. Then it suddenly went dark. I knew one shouldn't look at this muzzle of an active ray gun, but I couldn't resist. Now golden and black circles danced before my eyes. For a long time I saw nothing at all, even though I frantically pressed the button on my reflector. Finally the dark rings faded. The bed of rock was empty. Charred remains, lumps of slag, mountains of sticky ash extinguished, and smoldered, brown clouds of smoke mingled with the fog. Dirty mud-stained water seeped from between the stones. Somewhere in the darkness lumps of porridge, not yet completely burned, were smoking and bubbling. We descended. Before reaching the bottom of the ravine, we shone our reflectors down both sides. The black mass had disappeared. After we climbed the opposite slope, Arsenyev examined his fife. Slimy stain still glistened on the legs of his overalls, and his shoes had turned blackish grey. I bombarded him with questions. You've spoken of electric shock. Were you paralyzed by it? You too, engineer. What could have happened? What could it have been? Forward, forward, protested the astronomer, shaking off the last remnants of the sticky substance from his diving suit. We must move on. We can talk about it later. Since the other wall of the ravine was less steep, we had overcome this obstacle in half an hour and found ourselves on a plain where restless mist drifted back and forth. Now we could chat again during this march. It's fortunate that our diving suits have insulating properties, said Arsenyev. Otherwise, we would have been in trouble. What, Soltik? I had such a cramp I couldn't even open my mouth, the engineer replied. The moment I fell in, I received such a blow that I was almost paralyzed. I thought I was suffocating. All my muscles were stiff as wood. Fortunately, this creature had no experience in handling a good synthetic tissue, Raina interjected. My creature, do you think that this black mush is alive? I exclaimed, astonished. I believe it's a stream of living protoplasm. You saw it moving yourself. It reacted to touch and tried to grab hold of us and swallow us. It almost succeeded. So you mean I couldn't find the right word, that is some kind of animal, some kind of electric eel, an electric ray. Electric rays exist on Earth, but we're on Venus. It's neither animal nor plant, but simply living plasma. Living, that doesn't make sense to me, I replied. The water in the river moves too, and yet it wouldn't occur to anyone to call it living. It's a dispute over words, said Arsenyev. This mass has certain characteristics of a living substance, but it doesn't look as if... Wait a minute, what's that clanging? The darkness spread ever faster. It was getting night. For some time now I'd had the feeling that something strange was happening around me, but only now did I hear this clanging, which must have come from near us. I looked at my wrist, and was startled. I wore a magnetic compass there, which I hadn't used until now, as the gyro compass was much more reliable. Usually its needle glowed like a small fluorescent arrow, but now it had transformed into a circular, blurry, bright disk, whirling round its axis at incredible speed, emitting a faint but sharp noise. Just look, Professor. At that moment a flash appeared between the clouds, then quickly vanished. Motionless, silvery, like the clasped bellies of dead fish, the clouds hung in the darkness. A ghostly light lay over the ground. Everything around us seemed to melt, to dissolve. The atmosphere took on a strange appearance. Swaying bundles of wrinkled columns spread out, grew upwards, and became sources of a dull silver lightning. Now there was a flash here, now there, now lower, then higher layers of haze flashed up silently. In the fluttering grey shadows and yellowish light, fiery clusters and spheres circled and slowly sank to the ground in a cross of violet sparks. We involuntarily slowed our pace. I heard Arsenyev tell Raina that this phenomenon was a kind of electromagnetic storm. Just noticed the rhythmic extinguishing. The compass needle's revolution had become even faster. After a few seconds, however, the direction of rotation changed, and this jump from one direction to the other was accompanied by an extinguishing of the ghostly twilight. High above, the clouds drifted. They were so bright that one could see them through the fog. There was an oppressive silence. It seemed to bode badly. Arsenyev had interrupted his conversation with Raina. We stopped. The light grew fainter. It looked as if it was dispersing as it descended across the ground, while the higher layers of the atmosphere slipped further into darkness. The air around us remained silently motionless, but from the highest heights came a roar, at first very, very distant, which faded into a deep hum. I fear we'll have to return to the ravine, Arsenyev said. We were still standing there, undecided about what to do, when a howl ripped through the air as if an airplane were diving down. The fog began to move, swirled, and began to flow. The last flashes of electrical discharges died down. Out of the darkness, a sudden powerful gust of wind hit us, almost knocking us to the ground. We held each other's hands. Someone switched on his reflector. In the cone of light, we saw that the fog was no longer gathering, and was rushing past like streams of murky water shooting from an open sluice. None of us spoke a word. We turned around and ran, driven by terrible gusts, stumbling, falling, and laboriously staggering back to the ravine. The storm whistled piercingly in the antenna of our helmets. The air, which had become as hard as a billowing cloth, beat against our shoulders and rattled in the folds of our overalls. I don't know how long we sped on like this, on until before us in the darkness the outline of a cloud appeared, circling itself at a dizzying speed, still in one place. It was a swirl of thick fog that had formed between the edges of the gorge. The deeper we descended, the weaker the storm became. Its invisible outburst of fury rattled over the rocky ravine like a sail suddenly caught in the wind. We groped laboriously to a rocky overhang. The fog billowed like boiling water. Above us, on the plain, now plunged into darkness, resounded piercing howls, whimpers, crows, and laughter, as if packs of hyenas and jackals were fighting amongst themselves. Then suddenly everything was bathed in a brilliant white light, as if glowing mercury had dispelled the fog. A violent clap of thunder followed. There was a roar as if a heavy portcullis had slammed shut above us. At the same time I felt a light drumming on my hands and arms. Drops darting past at an angle flashed in the headlights. Rain. The drumming intensified. The wind up above now howled deafeningly, hurling the rain in waves against the rock. We leaned against the wall as close as we could. Water poured down from the helmets and scuba divers. Large puddles formed around us, foaming as the rain and wind drove in. Suddenly a furious drum roll sounded from the rocks, and then I heard bright blows against my helmet. Hailstones the size of beans slammed against the helmet and blinded us as they bounced off the glass. Come here, Arsenyev shouted. Indeed, a few steps further was a shallow niche in the wall. There we were, somewhat safe from the hail. The water, cascading down the rocky slopes, roared ever louder. In the circle of light from the spotlight that the astronomer had attached to his chest, the floor glinted with shattered ice. The rock protected us from the sides and above. However, I felt the splinters of the bursting ice cores on my legs, stinging like hundreds of tiny needles. Thunder roared repeatedly through the incessant howling of the hurricane. Bright flashes of lightning illuminated the rainstorms and the fog, which gathered and dispersed in a frantic flight. A gleaming light shone on the waterlogged rocks. Only with great effort did I manage to drag some flat stones and place them in the niche so that we could at least sit down. The rain lashed incessantly against our helmets and flowed down the glass pane. We remained huddled together. Hour after hour passed. The storm did not let up. The hail did stop, but instead shining snowflakes began to swirl down. We crouched there motionless. Calm, deep breaths betrayed that my companions had fallen asleep. Only I, tired as I was unable to sleep. I naturally realized that it was necessary to gather strength for the journey ahead, and so I closed my eyelids to shield myself from the howling and roaring of the storm. But beneath the thick blanket of darkness, the spinning wheel of today's experiences as impressions spun ceaselessly before my inner eye. I saw the billowing black mush before me again. Then the smoke from the helicopter bursting into flames rose out of the ravine, and the mysterious grotto appeared. Then again the mountain landscape with its rugged jagged peaks and fog-filled valleys passed by, with the sky as green as thick glass and a huge sun blazing in it. My muscles twitched with exhaustion. The rock radiated a piercing cold, but I didn't dare turn on the electric heater because the battery, which also powered the radio, had to be conserved. I couldn't fall asleep. I listened to the others' deep breathing and tried to carefully consider the recent events. Was the catastrophe really just a coincidence? Perhaps we were being watched, lurked by sinister, incomprehensible forces, while we believed we were acting freely according to our own will. I was unable to unite all these events into a coherent, clear picture. If the inhabitants of Venus were indeed metallic creatures, what did this stream of black protoplasm mean? And the grotto, was it perhaps a cemetery? How had that enormous crater been formed? Why had the pipe torn in two? Then I must have fallen asleep. It was a leaden sleep, bordering on unconsciousness. When I opened my eyes, all my bones were stiff. The clock showed 6 o'clock. In my home on Earth, dawn had already turned into broad daylight by this time, but here it was so dark that I couldn't even distinguish where the metal of the helmet met the glass of the small window. The pale radar screen, barely visible during the day, filled the interior of the helmet with its greenish phosphorescent light. The howling of the wind had diminished. The rain had also stopped. Carefully, so as not to wake up my companions, I got to my feet. The fabric of the suit was covered in a fine crust of ice that shattered like glass with every movement. I switched on the reflector for a moment and saw 3 motionless huddled figures crouching beneath between the rock. A thin mist, disturbed by this chilly breeze, drifted by. I began to move vigorously, hitting my shoulders and thighs with my hands. The noise woke Saltic. After a while, everyone had perked up, stood up, and complained about the cold. We continued our march. Icy gusts of wind swept across the plain, penetrating all the insulation of our scuba gear. The thin layer of ice on the puddles crackled beneath our feet. Sometimes the ground gave way with a splash, and we sank into the swampy ground. Once I turned around and let the light of the reflector glide over the figures trudging behind me. I saw inflamed eyes through the fogged-up helmet lenses, faces covered with 2-day-old stubble. As dusk fell at the edge of the ravine, we had heard the rocket's radio signals. In the magnetic storm they had fallen silent. Only now did we hear them again, and thus, despite the darkness, we were able to keep our direction and continue on without fear of getting lost. Meanwhile, one after the other slowed down, and the distance between us grew ever greater. Radar staggered behind Arseniev, bent over as if he had shrunk ahead. He could barely lift his fife. Suddenly he sat down. The astronomer turned around and spoke as if to a child. "Now, Heinrich, get up." Rainer didn't answer. He lay there half-stretched, his breath gasping. I stepped closer to help him, but the astronomer held me back. No, he'll get up on his own. The chemist braced his hands against the stones, pulled himself up with difficulty, as if under an enormous weight, and followed us. I don't remember much of the rest of the way. I felt as if my brain was gradually freezing. I continued on in half-sleep, from which I only awoke from time to time. The pressure in the oxygen cylinders had already dropped to 3 atmospheres. So we had to walk continuously, to reach our destination before they were empty. I had the vague feeling that someone was creeping behind us. The strange thing was that the others were also caught up in it. Rainer, who was dragging himself along last, fell a few times as he kept looking around. From time to time, We took turns leading, as it was too tiring to look for the way in this darkness. I had just taken the lead again when I spotted a white blurry column high in the clouds. Rough, bumpy slabs of rock rose from the stony ground, which now rose upwards. The white column swung slowly through the clouds, a new mysterious apparition. It flashed through my mind. An exclamation from the astronomer corrected my mistake. Boulders crunched beneath my feet. After a few hundred steps, we stood at the narrow passage to the lake. Far below, these of fog shimmered. From its depths, a glowing pillar rose into the sky, the spotlight of the rocket.